Hello! In the following, I would like to give you a presentation about the International Preliminary Examination under the PCT procedure. So what is the purpose of this procedure? Often referred to as the Chapter 2 procedure because it's regulated in Chapter 2 of the PCT treaty. When does it start? And what are the procedures that are being followed before the IPA, the International Preliminary Examining Authority? And as a last step, I would like to discuss the final report which is issued by the IPA, which is the IPRP Chapter 2, the International Preliminary Report on Patentability, Chapter 2 of the PCT. So what is the purpose of the Chapter 2 procedure? The purpose of International Preliminary Examination is to provide a preliminary non-binding opinion on the three main criteria of patentability which are applied by most offices the world over. What are these three criteria? That's novelty, inventiveness, and industrial applicability, sometimes also referred to as usefulness. It gives the PCT applicant an opportunity to overcome any possible objections which were raised by the examiner at the ISA in the search report and the written opinion of the ISA through filing of amendments under Article 34 of the PCT and or by filing certain arguments, counter-arguments against some of the findings of the examiner at the search stage. And of course, at the end of the day, we would hope that with a positive final report, this IPRP Chapter 2, which I already referred to, the national phase processing for this particular application, once then the applicant takes it into the national phase before the elected offices, should be simpler. Now, you need to keep in mind it's a non-binding report, so there's no legal binding effect. However, it does carry a lot of practical weight. Imagine a situation where an applicant enters the national phase before, let's say, a smaller office as an elected office, and he comes with a report issued by one of the big PCT authorities, the EPO, the USPTO, the JPO, for instance. Of course, you can imagine that such a report does carry some practical weight and will also help the elected office, that smaller office, to find it easier to accept such an application and to process it quickly under its national procedure. So when does International Preliminary Examination start? Well, it does start as soon as the IPA is in possession of course, the demand form. That's the form that needs to be used to start the procedure. As soon as they have in their possession the search report or an Article 17 declaration, that's a declaration sometimes issued by the ISA that no international search can be carried out. The fees under the Chapter 2 procedure will have to be paid, and they cannot start before the expiration of the time limit under 54 bis. The 54 bis time limit is also the time limit within which the applicant can file a demand to start a procedure. And it's a time limit of 3 months from the date of mailing of the search report and the written opinion, or 22 months from the priority date, whichever expires later. So before this time limit expires, the IPA examiner cannot pick up the file and start processing, examining it. Unless, and this is the one notable exception, unless the applicant in the demand form made an express request to have an early start of preliminary examination. The applicant will only do that, and we only recommend applicants to do that, if he's completely ready to start the procedure. That is, if all of his amendments are ready, or his arguments that he wished to submit to the IPA are ready, then of course he might choose to start preliminary examination as early as possible to give him additional time for the actual examination. The examiner at the IPA can also not start if the applicant has indicated that he included certain copies of amendments in his demand but did not actually furnish them. In this case, the PCT requires the examiner to invite the applicant to furnish the missing amendments, and that would give effectively the applicant additional time, if he's ever up against the time limit, to still furnish certain amendments which he hasn't done or he wasn't ready to submit at the time of filing of the demand. Sometimes the IPA also requires a translation. If the applicant was filed in a language not accepted by the IPA and also not translated into a language accepted by the A, then the applicant might have to provide a translation specifically for the Chapter 2 procedure. And that's obvious. Until that translation is available to the IPA, they cannot really start with the examination. So once examination starts, one important principle to always keep in mind is that an IPA is only obliged to search claims or to examine claims which have been searched by the ISA. So for instance, if there was a case of lack of unity of invention and the applicant chose not to pay any additional search fees, so part of the application did not get searched, well, those parts of the application which did not get searched, they will now also not get examined by the IPA, and they can declare so in the final report. If they find lack of unity at the stage of the international preliminary examination, the procedures are actually very similar to those before the ISA. So the examiner at the IPA will issue an invitation to the applicant to either restrict the claims or to pay additional preliminary examination fees. And the applicant can then choose to pay those additional fees and then get more claims examined by the IPA, or he does not pay and then certain claims will not be examined. The applicant during this procedure could also select the invention that he would like examined. But the applicant has to be very careful not to select an invention in his application, if there are multiple inventions in one application, to not select an invention which has not been searched by the searching authority, because again then the examiner at the IPA would not be obliged to do a search on those claims concerning that invention. There is also, of course, a need for a prior art definition in the Chapter 2 procedure. And that definition is actually very similar to the definition for the purposes of the international search. So it's defined as everything which has been made available to the public anywhere in the world by means of written disclosure. The one distinguishing feature is that the relevant date here is not the international filing date as for search, but the priority date. When the examiner at the IPA picks up the file, he will examine the application, but he does not, before issuing the final report, have to necessarily issue a written opinion. Why is that? Because under the PCT treaty and regulations, he's actually entitled to simply use the written opinion that was already established by the International Searching Authority, and he's not obliged to issue a second written opinion. Now, there are some exceptions. Some IPAs have told us if the written opinion of the ISA was established by a different authority, they will always establish also a written opinion of the IPA, a second written opinion if you so wish. And some officers have also indicated to us that as long as they find something negative in the case before issuing the final report of the Chapter 2 procedure, they will still go ahead and issue another written opinion, which would give the applicant another opportunity to come forth with amendments or with arguments. However, there could be many cases where no second written opinion is issued. And in these cases, it might be particularly interesting for applicants to rely on oral interviews. And an applicant has a right to at least one oral interview during the Chapter 2 procedure. And that oral interview should be requested up front expressly. When I would recommend when a demand is filed, request an oral interview to discuss the substance of your arguments or your amendments with the examiner at the IPA, and that would give the applicant another opportunity to get some feedback from the examiner before he or she draws up the final preliminary examination report, and allows the applicant that way to again maybe submit some amendments which could then overcome the remaining objections of the examiner. Now, I already mentioned this, the final report coming out of the Chapter 2 procedure is the IPRP Chapter 2, the International Preliminary Report on Patentability Chapter 2. It should, in principle, be established at around 28 months from the priority date, but sometimes it's established later, and the IPA has the right to establish it later if the applicant caused certain delays in the start of international preliminary examination. An example for that would be the applicant doesn't pay the fees right away, but later, and then it would be a 6-month time limit from receipt of the payment of the fees which would be the time limit to establish the IPRP Chapter 2, and if that time limit expires after 28 months, well, it would be that time limit within which the IPA would have to establish the final report. The IPRP Chapter 2 can contain what we call annexes, and these annexes most of the time are the Article 34 amendments which the applicant has submitted together with the demand or subsequently. Once the report is established, there is no provision for appeal. So it's a final decision by the IPA, but of course keep in mind once you enter the national phase, you can always rediscuss, of course, the case with the elected offices. Remember, it's a non-binding legal opinion, so of course there is room to re-argue the case with the national offices. The report is sent to the applicant and to the International Bureau, and we forward copies then to the elected offices. If need be, we would translate it into English and send an English translation then to the elected offices. Do keep in mind, however, that the annexes, mostly those Article 34 amendments which you have submitted, they will not be translated by us. So if you want to rely on these amendments, you need to remember to also translate them at the time when you enter national phase into the applicable language of the national office. So I hope this gave you an overview of the procedure called the International Preliminary Examination during the PCT. And as I said, it provides the applicant with an excellent opportunity to discuss his case with the examiner at the IPA. The ideal outcome, of course, would be a positive, maybe even a completely positive final report, and at least more positive than what the applicant was able to obtain in the international search report and the written opinion of the ISA. And if that is achieved, the processing of the application in the national phase should then become much easier for the applicants.